The lights inside the vast auditorium shimmered like 1,000 quiet stars, each one reflecting a dream that had traveled a long road to arrive here. The audience buzzed with anticipation, a low hum of voices and shuffling feet, unaware that they were moments away from witnessing something that would linger in their hearts long after the applause faded. Backstage, standing alone in a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of dust and fresh paint, was a man named JoJE. JoJE was not the kind of person who naturally commanded attention. He was tall but slightly stooped, as though years of carrying invisible weight had gently curved his shoulders. His hands trembled faintly, not from fear alone, but from the gravity of what he was about to offer. He wore a simple outfit, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress. His eyes, however, held something rare, a quiet depth, as if they had looked into sorrow and hope and found a fragile peace resting between the two. This stage was not his first encounter with music, but it was the first time he would sing not just for himself, not just for survival, but for something far greater. Music had been JoJE's companion since childhood, a refuge during nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness echoed through the thin walls of his home. He grew up in a place where dreams were often whispered instead of spoken aloud, because speaking them too loudly could make them feel foolish. As a boy, he would sit near a cracked window with a battered guitar resting on his knees, plucking strings that were often out of tune. His mother would hum softly in the background, her voice gentle but weary, as she folded clothes or prepared modest meals. She believed in God with a faith that was unshakable, even when life gave her very little reason to. She used to tell JoJE that music was a prayer when words were not enough, that every note carried the power to rise upward if it came from a sincere heart. Those words stayed with him. When his mother passed away, the house felt unbearably silent. JoJE was still young, too young to understand why someone so kind had to leave so soon. In his grief, he stopped speaking to God altogether. He felt abandoned, as though his prayers had been lost somewhere between heaven and earth. But even in that silence, music remained. Late at night, when the world slept, he would sing quietly, his voice breaking, his songs filled with questions that had no answers. Years passed, and life hardened him in subtle ways. He worked odd jobs, sang in small cafes where no one listened closely, and played on street corners where people tossed coins without ever meeting his eyes. Still, he sang. Not because he expected recognition, but because singing was the only way he knew how to breathe fully. Every song carried fragments of his pain, his doubts, and his longing for something divine that he could not quite touch. When he heard about the auditions, he laughed at first. Shows like that were for people with big voices and bigger confidence, not for someone like him. But one night, as he sat alone with his guitar, he felt a strange pull, a quiet nudge inside his chest. It reminded him of his mother's voice, of her belief that music could bridge the gap between earth and heaven. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer, unsure if anyone was listening. Standing backstage now, JoJE closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The muffled sound of applause from the previous act faded, and a stagehand gestured for him to get ready. His heart pounded so loudly that he wondered if the judges could hear it before he even stepped onto the stage. He pressed his fingers together, grounding himself, and silently promised that no matter what happened, he would sing honestly. As he walked onto the stage, the brightness of the lights momentarily blinded him. The audience blurred into a sea of faces, indistinct yet immense. The judges sat before him, their expressions neutral, professional, unreadable. He introduced himself softly, his voice almost swallowed by the vastness of the room. When asked why he was there, he paused, searching for the right words. "I'm here," he said slowly, "because music saved me when I didn't know how to save myself. And because I believe it can bring us closer to God." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but expectant. He adjusted the microphone, lifted his guitar, and for a split second, doubt threatened to undo him. Then he remembered the nights by the window, his mother's hum, and the countless moments when music had been his only companion. He began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper offered with care. His voice followed, raw and unpolished, carrying a vulnerability that could not be rehearsed. It was not technically perfect, but it was profoundly sincere. Each word felt as though it had been carved from his own soul, shaped by loss, faith, and fragile hope. As the song unfolded, something shifted in the room. Conversation ceased. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the honesty pouring from the stage. JoJi sang of brokenness and surrender, of questioning God and finding Him not in thunder or miracles, but in quiet moments of grace. His lyrics spoke of falling to one's knees not in defeat, but in trust. The music grew stronger, rising like a tide. His voice trembled at times, cracking under the weight of emotion, yet that imperfection only made it more powerful. Tears welled in his eyes, and he did not hide them. He let them fall, believing that vulnerability was not weakness, but truth. In the audience, people felt something stir within them. Some closed their eyes, others clasped their hands together unconsciously. For a few precious minutes, the room felt less like a competition and more like a sanctuary. It was as if the performance had stripped away distractions, leaving only the shared human longing for meaning, forgiveness, and love. When the final note lingered in the air and faded into silence, no one moved. The quiet was heavy, reverent, almost sacred. JoJi stood still, his head bowed, his breathing uneven. He had given everything he had, and now there was nothing left to offer. Then the applause began, slowly at first, like raindrops, then swelling into a powerful wave. People rose to their feet, clapping not just for a performance, but for a moment that had touched something deep within them. The judges looked at one another, visibly moved. One wiped away a tear before speaking. That, one of them said, voice thick with emotion, didn't feel like an audition. It felt like a prayer. Another judge leaned forward. You didn't just sing to us, they said. You reminded us of something we forget too often. That faith doesn't have to be loud to be strong. JoJi listened, overwhelmed, his hands shaking again, this time not from fear, but from gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not just as a singer, but as a soul. As he left the stage, the lights dimming behind him, he felt lighter, as though he had set down a burden he had been carrying for years. Whether he advanced in the competition no longer mattered. What mattered was that he had honored his journey, his pain, and his faith. He had sung not to impress, but to connect, and in doing so, he had found a quiet peace. Outside the auditorium, the night air was cool and still. JoJi looked up at the sky, dotted with stars, and smiled softly. For the first time since his mother's passing, he felt close to God again. Not because of answers or miracles, but because he had opened his heart and let his voice become a bridge between earth and heaven. And somewhere beyond the applause, beyond the stage and the lights, his song continued to echo, gently reminding anyone who heard it that sometimes, the most heavenly performances are born from broken hearts, lifted by faith, and offered humbly in love.